Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast is your one-stop shop for fantasy football news and advice. Can't decide on who to draft on the first round? Going gaga on how to line up your team. We've got you covered. Traditional leagues, dynasty league, PPR league, IDP league, even daily fantasy football league. Join us as we break down all the questions of fantasy football. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast.
And welcome to the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast, brought to you, as always, by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, BSP, Brandon Soderpenner. Hope that everyone was finally able to get a taste of live sports over the last few days. Of course, Major League Baseball starting at the end of last week, and then NBA basketball finally kicking off Thursday night. There was a couple great games. The Clippers and Lakers going head-to-head, LeBron hitting a game winner. It just brought back a lot of great feelings for me. So I hope you guys were able to share in that as well. But you have tuned in to an excellent show, guys. If you're listening right now, we've got tons to get into. Going to give you the 5 burning fantasy questions here in their first segment. We're going to wrap up the wide receiver preview series with the NFC and AFC West wide receiver rooms. And to top it all off, we're going to do something a little bit different. I'm still going to give you a top 10, but this is not an opinion piece this time around. I'm going to give you the top 10 fantasy football seasons of all time. So we're going to relive some awesome fantasy football history, so make sure that you stay tuned and listen to that at the end of the podcast. So before we get into all that, we do have some NFL news that is pertinent to the fantasy landscape. So we'll start off with news that broke late Thursday night, and that's that free agent running back LeSean McCoy has agreed to a 1-year deal to sign with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Here's why that move is confusing to me. And it's frustrating, too, because Ronald Jones, one of their running backs, it's him and Keyshawn Vaughn, the rookie right now. Ronald Jones has been slowly moving up my board because things that have been leaking, and then other fantasy experts have been kind of coming to the same consensus that especially early on, Ronald Jones was going to get the bulk of the work because he was a little more established than Vaughn. But now, even though he's washed up at this point in his career, bringing in LeSean McCoy and adding that name to that running back room just makes everything so much more confusing. So I'm kind of back to square one on the Buccaneers running back situation now. I thought that I would be comfortable drafting Ronald Jones late where he was going. His ADP is still in the 30s. But now with 3 guys there that are going to share touches, I'm kind of avoiding all of them right now. I'm definitely not drafting McCoy until he really proves something because, I mean, when he was with, I want to say he was with Kansas City last year, he just hasn't really been able to produce for a while now. He's not, Philadelphia LeSean McCoy or Buffalo LeSean McCoy anymore. But they did bring him in for a reason, and he's going to have some sort of role, and I think from a fantasy standpoint, all it's going to do is detract from the other 2 running backs that they have there rather than give you another viable fantasy option. So until further notice, guys, I am fading all of the Tampa Bay running backs until we get some sort of idea about how they want to really utilize these guys, because this kind of signals that either they don't have a lot of confidence in either of their running backs right now, or they think LeSean McCoy still has something special enough to where he can contribute to the team even with those 2 guys in front of him. So that's very concerning to me. But yeah, again, big news. LeSean McCoy, now a Tampa Bay Buccaneer, and just a big name team down there right now. Tom Brady, Rob Gronkowski, LeSean McCoy, and then of course Mike Evans, Chris Godwin, O.J. Howard. A lot of offensive firepower down there in Tampa, but from a running back perspective, it's just way too murky of a situation to really be touching any of those guys right now. And then finally, guys, this is going to be something that I'm now going to have to provide every episode. And it's very sad and it's very frustrating to me, but we're starting to see more and more players opt out of the 2020 NFL season due to concerns about COVID, which I completely understand, guys. I mean, these players, they have money, they have security. The one thing that they don't have is a guarantee for their health and the health of those around them. So up to just a couple of days ago, no one had really dropped out that was going to have a giant effect on the fantasy landscape. We've seen some defensive players, we've seen some offensive linemen, but a couple of big names actually did come down very recently, starting with Damian Williams. The story of this is pretty sad. His mother was diagnosed with cancer not too long ago, so because of the risk factors associated with that and the fact that she really, if she were to get COVID, things can just spiral out of control. He has decided to opt out of the fantasy season. Of course, if you don't know, Damian Williams, running back for the Kansas City Chiefs, he was the feature back last year when the team made a run at the Super Bowl and eventually did win. He wasn't an amazing fantasy back, but just because he was getting volume, he was a starter for a lot of people's fantasy teams. And more importantly, this year, he is the one player that could have kept Clyde Edwards-Helaire from really taking the starting spot after they drafted him at the end of round 1. So again, very unfortunate situation. Damian Williams is now out of the league. I know a lot of people have probably drafted him already, so you're going to be scrambling to figure out exactly what to do to replace him. And then if you have drafted Clyde Edwards-Helaire, you probably got a very good deal on him now because the path for him to be the number 1 running back in Kansas City just opened way up. And if you haven't taken him yet, try to grab him before his ADP skyrockets if it hasn't already, because he is going to be a much more coveted running back now in 2020 drafts. And then the other player that opted out that's going to have a bit of an effect on the fantasy season, that was Devin Funchess, the wide receiver for Green Bay. It would have been his first year in Green Bay, and he didn't have a promised role, but he was one of the players that I specifically was predicting could have had a somewhat of a breakout year, enough to be a wide receiver 3 for you to consider, just because he was tied to Aaron Rodgers in that offense, and the number 2 wide receiver spot behind Devontae Adams was definitely up for grabs. So Funchess is out of the race for that. I think that really opens up the door for Adam Lazard to secure that second spot. You've got Valdez-Scantling that could potentially fight him for it, but he's had plenty of opportunities and has just never really made the most of it. So I think Adam Lazard now shores up that second wide receiver spot in Green Bay, which could prove to be incredibly valuable. So yeah, so every episode now, I'm going to take a look at the opt-out list and see if there's any other players that you need to be informed about. Anybody that may have already been drafted or could affect your draft strategy, I will make sure to get you guys that news as things update, because I don't know about you, but the Damian Williams news caught me off guard when I went to go record this morning. I didn't get a push notification. I didn't really see it anywhere. It just kind of leaked out. And I think it's going to be a lot of that as more and more players start to add their name to the opt-out list. So make sure you're listening in at the beginning of every podcast, and I will make sure to keep you as informed on this list as I possibly can. All right, moving on, guys. Time to answer the 5 burning fantasy questions for today's episode. Remember, you can submit your questions on Twitter. That is the easiest way to reach us. You can submit your questions to either the show's Twitter account, which is going to be at GSMC_FFootball, or you can send them to me directly. I am at LaMachine17. That is at LaMachine17. And I would love to get your fantasy questions answered live and on the podcast. So here's what we have for you today. So after today's episode, we will be done with the wide receiver preview series. And next episode, I'll be breaking down my full top 30 wide receivers for fantasy in 2020. And then after that, we start diving into the quarterbacks and tight ends together from an episode to episode basis. So the first few questions are going to be based around the tight end and quarterback positions. So let's go. Number 1, where are you targeting top-tier tight ends? At this point, we know who they are. I've talked about it extensively. It's George Kittle, it's Travis Kelce, and it's Mark Andrews. And we know there's a steep drop-off after these guys, but it still might be difficult to figure out when exactly you want to draft them in your redraft leagues, because we push the importance of running backs and wide receivers. Tight ends usually kind of get lost, but having an elite guy who is going to be top tier at the position has some real value to it. So the way I'm looking at it, I think Kelsey is in a tier of his own. I think he's above George Kittle. I like George Kittle a lot, but they have a tendency to use him in blocking schemes as well. And we know Shanahan's not afraid to not force feed somebody from week to week based on his game plan. So I think you might see sometimes where Kittle is not necessarily heavily utilized in their offense. It's not any fault of his. It's a fault of the system. But when he is used, he's, again, a top 2 tight end in the league. So I'm just fading him slightly underneath Kelsey. We know Kelsey has an established role in that passing attack in Kansas City. We know how much Kansas City is going to be throwing the ball around the yard as well. So if I'm targeting Kelsey, if he's somebody that you really want on your fantasy team, you're going to have to get him in round 2. And I've got no problem taking a tight end there because Kelsey's going to be giving you wide receiver 1 numbers from a position that no one else at that point will really be able to compete with you. Like, someone else can get Kittle and Andrews, but that's only 2 other players that are going to get anywhere near that production for the tight end spot, and everyone else is going to have to make up for it with tight end flyers and then hope that the running backs and wide receivers that they took ahead of Kelsey, Kittle, and Andrews are going to be able to outproduce them week in and week out. So I like Kelsey as a round 2 pick. I don't see him getting out of that spot in many leagues. And then Kittle and Andrews, I think round 3 is where you're going to really want to be targeting them. Andrews is tied to an offense that doesn't throw the ball a lot, but he is going to be the number 1 target there in Baltimore. We saw Lamar Jackson and him connect very quickly, so he'll be used a lot in the passing game. And then Kittle, again, his upside is definitely worth it. There's going to be a lot of weeks where he's utilized in that offense, and the only reason he's not with Kelsey in round 2, for me personally, is, again, just the potential that he can be used in schemes where he's not going to be picking up fantasy points for you. So if you're targeting Kelsey, round 2, I have a feeling that Kittle's going to go in round 2 as well, but I'm not taking him until round 3. If he's still available there for me in the 3rd round, I'll grab him. Same with Mark Andrews there. So after that, guys, there's a bunch of middling tight ends you probably really don't want to associate with. At that point, I would just wait to take a guy that you're high on. Grab someone that's a little bit of a lottery ticket. You can get Austin Hooper late. You can get Hayden Hurst late. Just get someone that has potential to really break out for you because it's going to be just as safe as a bet as a lot of those middle-tier tight end options. So now number 2, going to shift over to quarterbacks. And this is an approach that you've heard me talk about a lot, and it's one that I use in almost every draft. So when you are taking the late quarterback approach, who are some of the guys you are targeting? So I like getting the quarterback late because you can usually find value and find someone that can break out for you without having to spend a high pick on them. And then you're able to then load up on wide receivers and running backs and then even tight ends if that's what you choose to do. So I've got a top 5 here. Number 5, Phillip Rivers, guys, quarterback 24. He's a little bit of a risk because of his age, but I really think that a change of scenery is going to do him well. He's got an awesome offensive line now in Indianapolis. I think that was a big issue for him in LA last year, right? His offensive linemen all mastered the floor mat technique, and he was constantly getting hit and having to put up desperation passes. So I think Rivers is due for a big year, and you can get him in any draft as long as it's not a 2-quarterback league. You can pretty much get him wherever you want. Number 4 is Joe Burrow. Again, rookie quarterbacks don't tend to produce right out of the gate, but Burrow is a very NFL-ready prospect. He was a 4-year player in college. He's stepping into a much improved offense. He's got an excellent running back behind him in Joe Mixon. He's got a solid wide receiving core. So everything's really setting up for Joe Burrow to potentially have a breakout year. And again, someone that you can more than likely get at any point in your draft. Number 3, Cam Newton. He continues to move up boards. When I first talked about him coming to New England, he was sitting at quarterback 19. Now he's at quarterback 16. So again, single quarterback, you can still grab him wherever you need. He's got league-winning potential. If he's anything like the player he was in Carolina, then Bill Belichick is going to be able to find that in him. I like the fit now. He's got a solid core of wide receivers. He's had a whole offseason, really a season and offseason to get healthy and to get ready to go back on the field. So, again, like Cam Newton as a lottery ticket type pick. Number 2, Aaron Rodgers. Guys, I've been talking about how I think that Green Bay can fall apart, but Aaron Rodgers is going as quarterback 13. The dude still has ability. So if you can get him as the last quarterback taken in your draft, then do it. Now, personally, I think he's going to be higher, right? This quarterback 13 ranking is based on expert consensus, and his name alone will probably still get him drafted above there. But if, everyone in your league listens to these fantasy guys and Rodgers is still available when almost everyone else is taking a quarterback, then he's absolutely worth the risk to try to take. And then number 1, guys, is Matt Stafford, right? He got hurt last year, but the 4 games that he was healthy, he was on pace to be a top 5 fantasy quarterback last year. He's got improved weapons. I really like Kenny Golladay and Marvin Jones as receiving options. He's got 2 good running backs behind him now as well with Kerryon Johnson and DeAndre Swift, who I think they're going to utilize quite a bit in the passing game. And Stafford's proven, guys, right? The injury last year was an anomaly. He doesn't miss a whole lot of time, and I think he's got the potential to finish as a top 5 fantasy quarterback this year. And he's going, again, at that 12 spot where most other quarterbacks will be off the board by the time you are looking to grab Matt Stafford. All right, so that is question number 2. Now, number 3. So just wanted to give really an update here. The question was, can you give an update on Raheem Mostert? And there was some contract issues where he was threatening to hold out over a new deal. It turned out that he wasn't looking for anything crazy. He just wanted a slight bump in his contract, and as of a couple days ago, he got it, guys. The contract issue has been resolved. So Raheem Mostert will be on the 49ers, which does bump his value up quite a bit. However, you do still have to consider that just because he's going to be the starter, it doesn't mean he's going to get the running back one load there every week. Shanahan loves his running back by committee, but the good news is it's a very run-heavy offense. Mostert is the clear number 1 guy. Contract is fixed. I've moved him up significantly, guys. He was outside of my top 30. I'm now putting him at 21 ahead of David Montgomery and Kareem Hunt in my rankings. And again, you got to worry about that running back by committee, but Mostert, I think, is a clear step ahead of both Tevin Coleman and Jerick McKinnon, who can't really seem to stay on the field. So like him a lot better now that I know he's going to be in San Francisco because we've seen that system caters well to him, and he will be able to produce. All right, number 4, going to talk about kickers, guys. Yeah, so strap in. I know it's not the most sexy topic in the world, but still has to be talked about. A lot of leagues are still drafting defenses and kickers. And in this situation, I took a look, and the question was just, who is your number 1 kicker for 2020? So I already mentioned I'm not going to do a preview series for defenses or kickers because I know you guys really don't want that. So I'm going to give you little bits of information where I can. So when it comes to the number 1 kicker, it really came down to 2 guys for me. It's Harrison Butker, who is Kansas City's kicker, who is tied to an incredibly high-volume offense. And then there's Justin Tucker, who has been the clear best kicker in the NFL from an accuracy standpoint, from a leg standpoint, but his offense may not score quite as much because they're going to be able to get ahead in games a little bit easier than Kansas City will, and it's Lamar Jackson throwing the ball versus Patrick Mahomes. So the more I looked at it, Justin Tucker pretty much misses nothing. However, he did still only attempt 29 field goals last year. Then when you go to flip up to Harrison Butker, even though he's not quite as accurate, he's still incredible. He went 34 for 38 on field goals and 45 of 48 from extra points. So this isn't just drafting a kicker because he's attached to a good offense. Butker is also an excellent kicker on top of that. So the more I look at it, it's got to be Harrison Butker as the number 1 kicker this year. Justin Tucker is still the more talented guy, even though he's been in the league for 10-plus years now. But the combination of Butker's ability and his ties to the Kansas City offense make him the clear number 1 kicker for 2020. All right, question number 5, guys. This is the one that we always try to have a little bit more fun with. And I got the idea of this question from my wife originally as a joke, and then I actually sat down and thought about it and put way more thought into this than I'm really proud of. So question number 5. Compare the following fantasy quarterbacks to pizza. And on the list is Patrick Mahomes, Lamar Jackson, Ben Roethlisberger, and Mitch Trubisky. And Tom Brady. Oh, I almost missed Tom Brady. So, for example, and I'll give you a guy from outside of this, the question is finding a pizza that compares the best to one of these quarterbacks. So, like Derek Carr, I said was just a traditional cheese pizza. He's really good, but often overlooked because of the other options out there. But he's never going to do anything to surprise you. He's not going to take risks. It's kind of there. It's pizza. It's decent. It'll get you by. But cheese pizza, underrated. I think Carr's underrated. Not going to get into all that right now. So let's start. So the first name was Patrick Mahomes. And Mahomes, guys, he is a traditional supreme pizza. He's got the works as far as toppings go. He's got extra cheese. He's got extra marinara sauce. He's got the whole 9 for you, and it's going to hold up well. It's baked perfectly. The elite option when it comes to pizza. And then right behind him, guys, Lamar Jackson. He's the same exact deal. He's a supreme. He's got the extra sauce, extra cheese, everything. However, he's a thin crust, right? So there's an advantage and a disadvantage to that. The thin crust is going to cook a little bit faster for you, actually significantly faster in some cases. He's got good speed from a pizza perspective, but it's going to be more brittle, guys. With all those toppings and sauce and cheese and everything, it's got the potential to kind of crumble on you, and because of that, it's just a slight step behind that traditional crust that's really going to be able to hold up all those things that you really love. Next up, Tom Brady. Pepperoni pizza, guys. He's a classic. He's the most popular topping. Again, not going to take a ton of risks at this point, but it more than gets the job done, and it's a classic, right? There's no argument at this point that pepperoni is one of the GOAT pizzas because it's something that everybody can agree on is fantastic. And it's still solid enough to get the job done no matter how long it has been around. All right, last two guys. Ben Roethlisberger, right? He is the grocery store pizza that's been at the back of the freezer, and it's got a layer of frostbite on it, right? So there's a chance that you pop that out, you kind of scrape off whatever ice you can, you throw it in the oven, and it's still delicious. There's nothing wrong with at-home pizza at all. It could still do everything that you need it to do, but you are running the risk of that frostbite setting in, and when you take that first bite, it just tastes absolutely awful. So it's really a 50-50 proposition at this point with that frozen pizza, but you're hungry, and there's not really any better options available to you, so you still give it a shot and hope for the best. And then finally, guys, it's Mitch Trubisky, right? He is a brick oven pizza with an inexperienced cook, right? He's got everything you want, right? He was a high draft pick. There was something there, obviously. But whoever is making these decisions and processing is just leaving it in the oven too long every time, and it's coming out burnt and gross. There's nothing worse than a brick oven pizza that has been overcooked, and it just gets ridiculously crumbly, and you get the burnt flavor everywhere, and it's bad. I know this from experience. I used to work at a bar and grill that had one of these ovens, and man, if you had somebody operating it that didn't know what they were doing, it was garbage. So there you have it, guys. I'm pretty sure you weren't expecting to hear any of that today, but that is my fantasy quarterback to pizza comparison. So anyway, on a more serious note, when we come back, going to wrap up our wide receiver preview series, going to give you a look at the wide receivers of the NFC and AFC West, and then again at the end of the show, going to give you the top 10 fantasy seasons of all time. You're listening to the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast. We'll be right back.
Are you looking for the very best NFL and college football podcast? Then check out the GSMC Football Podcast. Get the latest football news both on and off the field. From the NFL Draft to trades to the rumor mill to the NFL Combines, they got you covered. That's GSMCpodcast.com/football-podcast. Get updates on college rivalries, game day insights, and much, much more. It's football talk the way you want it. This show eats, sleeps, and breathes football. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
And welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast. I am your host, BSP, Brandon Soderpenner. Last segment, again, unfortunately, had to talk about the effect that the coronavirus is going to have on the NFL, specifically with players now starting to opt out. Also answered your 5 burning fantasy questions and even compared quarterbacks to pizza. Yeah, so if you didn't hear that, definitely rewind a little bit and listen to that segment. That was a lot of fun. But enough of all that. It is time to get into our last episode of the wide receiver preview. So today I'm going to take a look at the NFC and AFC West. And what that means, guys, is the next episode is going to be even more exciting, as I will give you my top 30 fantasy wide receivers for 2020. Going to be the same format as we're doing here. Going to give you 30 to 16 in the first segment, and then your top 15 in the second portion. And it's always a ton of fun to go through. Going to give you my definitive rankings as to where everyone is going to land. But let's go ahead and dive into it. So first, we're going to go with the NFC West. Start with the Arizona Cardinals, a team that I am actually relatively high on this year. They, of course, have DeAndre Hopkins. They were able to steal him from Houston for David Johnson and a bag of peanuts. Still really not sure what happened there, but good for them. So DeAndre Hopkins, some people are worried because he is switching teams. Kyler Murray, while he is rising, is not as established as Deshaun Watson, and I don't think you can make the argument that he's better than Deshaun Watson yet. However, not worried about that at all. Hopkins has been able to produce with the following quarterbacks: Ryan Fitzpatrick, Matt Schaub, Brock Osweiler, Case Keenum, Ryan Mallett, Brian Hoyer, TJ Yates, Brandon Weeden, and Tom Savage. Oh, and Deshaun Watson, by the way. It does not matter who's throwing the ball. DeAndre Hopkins is such an elite wide receiver that he's able to pull in passes from anywhere on the field. His catch radius is out of this world. He's not necessarily a great yak receiver, but he doesn't have to be. He's going to be able to come down with the ball wherever you place it. So the fact that he's going to Arizona now with Kyler Murray, it doesn't scare me, because Kyler Murray is significantly better than all of those quarterbacks I just listed, with the exception of Deshaun Watson. So the only issue that Hopkins might face is increased competition. There's a lot of talented receivers there in Arizona. Larry Fitzgerald has yet to retire. They've got Christian Kirk, who's a nice young receiver. And then Andy Isabella, who, while he hasn't broken out yet, still has, the talent, the potential to turn into something. But DeAndre Hopkins is still a solid step ahead of everybody, right? Think about it like this. Last year, in 2019, was his down year. And his down year was 1,165 yards, 7 touchdowns in 15 games. That's the worst year that he's had since his rookie season, right? This dude is elite. He will be able to produce wherever you put him, and unless you've got Michael Thomas or Julio Jones on the same team as him, right, no one is going to be challenging him for targets whatsoever. Even though I do like the rest of these guys on the team, it's the DeAndre Hopkins show. He will be the primary target there, so I have no problem with him at wide receiver 5. I might be bumping him slightly. I have to take a look at the other top-tier wide receivers, but again, love DeAndre Hopkins in 2020. Now moving on to the other receivers there in Arizona, you've got Christian Kirk. He's sitting at about wide receiver 38. His ADP is near 100. In 2019, even with Kyler Murray, with it being his first year with that pretty terrible offensive line, he was still able to produce enough to get you wide receiver 3 numbers. He got 108 targets, 3 touchdowns. Again, he's still young, and I think he's going to get more efficient the more that he plays, obviously. I think he's going to improve as a wide receiver in 2020. I like his ability a lot. However, that jump that he's going to have in ability, I think, is going to be canceled out by Hopkins showing up. And on top of that, even though Kirk is the second most talented receiver on this team right now, there's not a clear-cut number 2, because as long as Larry Fitzgerald is still in Arizona, he's going to have a legitimate role. So there's a really good chance that Kirk and Fitzgerald start to split targets, and we're just not sure what that's going to look like until the season really gets going. So on that note, moving on now to Larry Fitzgerald, he's sitting at wide receiver 68. His ADP is almost up in the 200s. And guys, last year still had 109 targets, right? 804 yards, 4 touchdowns. So still low-key wide receiver 3 numbers. And now even with the addition of Hopkins, like I just mentioned, Larry Fitzgerald has established himself to the point where he will always have a role on the team until he either retires or he just can't play anymore. And even though he's way up there in age, he hasn't shown any reason to think that he still can't play. He's coming back year after year. I like Fitzgerald at this ADP because he's going to have a cutout role in the offense. He's not going to be a huge boomer bust guy. But at ADP, what I said, almost 200, he's someone that you can put on the end of your bench that can get you consistent production. He'll be nice in bye weeks, and he'll be nice in an emergency flex start if you need him. And on top of that, we mentioned that he's a little bit older. Again, the ability hasn't dropped off a ton, and he hasn't gotten hurt either, guys. He's missed 2 games in the last 7 seasons. 7 seasons he's missed 2 games. And then you have guys like Will Fuller who missed, 19 games in his first 3 seasons? Fitzgerald is reliable, and if you're looking for some late value, he's definitely someone you need to be considering. Again, at ADP, he's listed at 189 right now, but depending on where you look, you can get him as late as, early 200s as well. And then Andy Isabella, guy I also mentioned, he's sitting at wide receiver 88. His ADP is in the 250s. He was a high draft pick. He was a second-round pick just a couple of years ago, and I like Isabella as a player. He's a true slot guy. He's got great speed. His yak ability is off the charts. However, I'm just unsure of what his role is going to be. We saw him not get a ton of touches even when it was just Christian Kirk and Larry Fitzgerald really on the roster as far as talent goes. So now with DeAndre Hopkins arriving, it's going to be very questionable about whether or not Andy Isabella is going to have a role on this team. It's unfortunate because he's talented, and they might be able to find something for him to do. They're going to be passing the ball a ton, but Isabella is nothing more than someone you want to monitor on waiver wires. If we see in weeks 1 or 2 that they're utilizing him a lot, then maybe he's someone you snag and you take a chance on. Someone that might be able to step up if there's an injury to Christian Kirk or someone else on the team, but nothing more than that. He's not really worth drafting because we just don't know what his role is going to be, and right now it doesn't look like he's going to have much of one. Moving on now to another divisive wide receiver room, and that's the Los Angeles Rams. This is another situation where you've got 2 guys within a few ADP points of each other, and people are kind of debating as to who's going to be the real number 1 receiver on the team, if there is one. I mean, there is a chance these guys just completely split. But my 2 cents on the whole thing. So you've got Cooper Kupp. He's sitting at wide receiver 17. His ADP is about 31. The reason Kupp isn't higher is because of how he ended 2020, and it was not his fault. But we saw his production drop severely after the bye week, because that's when the Rams started running a lot more 2 tight end formations, 21 personnel, and Kupp was just not on the field much at all. Now, I was a proud Cooper Kupp owner last season, and everything was going great, but then he quite literally went from the wide receiver 2 before the break to finishing as the wide receiver 31 for the rest of the season. That's an insane drop. He was just not utilized, and I don't understand that because we've seen Jared Goff have his most success when Cooper Kupp is on the field. But regardless, they started running a lot more heavy 2 tight end formations, and I don't think that they're going to go away from that. Just judging by the way that they've handled the offseason, they've added Cam Akers. They spent their very first pick in the draft, which is their second-round pick, on Cam Akers to be their running back on a team that has a lot of other issues that needed to be addressed. So obviously, they still really want to run the ball. They want to ground and pound. And they also brought in Bryson Hopkins just a couple of rounds later, the big tight end. This suggests that the situation is not going to change. McVay saw something that he liked running these heavy sets, and he's going to continue to do it. So that's only going to hurt Cooper Kupp, unfortunately. He's a great player, but it's going to be a tough year for him, I think. Long story short, Cooper Kupp is always going to have a high ceiling for you just because of how electric he is with the ball in his hands. But the system and the way that the Rams have handled the offseason really give him high bust potential here at wide receiver 17. So that's going to lead me into my next guy, and that's Robert Woods. He is sitting at wide receiver 18 right now. His ADP, though, 20 points later. So the experts are pretty close on Woods and Kupp, But Cooper Kupp is going nearly 2 rounds before Robert Woods in most drafts. So here's what I like about Robert Woods. He's stayed on the field constantly in 2019. Even when the Rams started shifting their offensive philosophy, Woods was still out there and available to grab targets. In addition, Woods is set to benefit a lot more from Brandon Cooks leaving than Cooper Kupp is. Cooks and Woods were kind of competing for that same outside wide receiver spot where Kupp is really established in the slot. So Woods is going to have more opportunity from there. He's set to be the true number one wide receiver in this offense, with then Cooper Kupp still establishing the slot and not seeing the field nearly as much. He's also due for some major positive touchdown regression. Robert Woods only had 2 touchdowns last year, and he still finished at the wide receiver 17, which is just 1 slot above where he's getting picked now. That alone should be leading you to want to pick up Robert Woods. Just the fact that you can only find the end zone twice and still have consistent enough fantasy numbers to finish that high shows you that he is an excellent fantasy option. So everything considered right now, I think Robert Woods is a steal at his ADP. Again, 52, he's got the potential to finish as a true fantasy wide receiver 1. Even with Cooks and Kupp last year, he was still able to nab 140 targets. And as crazy as it is to say, he might be able to top even that this year. So I'm moving Robert Woods way up my draft board. I like him a lot in 2020. And then one last thing that I forgot to mention with his touchdown regression. Like I said, he had 140 targets. Only 5 wide receivers in NFL history have hauled in 90 catches or more and only scored 2 touchdowns. So if he puts up anywhere near this production again, chances are he's going to have some pretty crazy positive touchdown regression, and it's going to make him very, very valuable. Then the last guy on the team that's worth mentioning, it's Josh Reynolds. He's sitting at wide receiver 81. His ADP is about 258, and he has some value because he should be the regular starter now with Brandon Cooks gone. But here's the bad news. He's still probably going to be the 4th or 5th option in that offense, right? You've got Cooper Kupp, you've got Robert Woods, you've got Tyler Higbee at tight end, and then Cam Akers, who was utilized a lot in the passing game at Florida State. I see McVay, especially when he's running these heavier sets, going to him a lot for a lot of these short running back dump-offs as well. So even though Reynolds will be on the field quite a bit, it's going to be hard for him to see any kind of consistent volume. He might be a bye-week option for you. He's got a chance to produce there every once in a while. He'll have some value if there's an injury. But other than that, Reynolds is someone that you should avoid for the most part. Oh, and then there is Van Jefferson. I did forget about him, the rookie that they brought in this year. He could compete with Reynolds for that 3rd spot, and it might be worth monitoring on your waiver wire at least. But Van Jefferson is coming in pretty raw, and I think it's going to take some time for him to really start competing to see the field, especially with all those other offensive weapons that they already have in Los Angeles. All right, next up, what is it with good teams and having very, very bad fantasy wide receiver rooms? Of course, I'm originally talking about the Ravens when I took a look at them, but now the San Francisco 49ers, I'm kind of seeing the same thing. I'm avoiding pretty much all of these guys that are considered draftable this year. So we'll start with Deebo Samuel. He is wide receiver 40. His ADP is somewhere in the 60s. Now, he had a good rookie season, guys. He had 81 targets, 802 yards, and 3 touchdowns through the air, and added 3 more touchdowns rushing the ball. So a very Swiss Army knife type of player, especially in 2019. So a couple things against him, though. He was inconsistent from week to week. He finished with pretty good numbers, but as we see with a lot of players in the Kyle Shanahan offense, he had weeks where he just would not show up at all, as if they just really didn't game plan around him. On top of that, he was injured, and it was in the middle of the offseason, which is very concerning to me. It's still unclear as to when he'll be back. There's a lot of rumors swirling that he will not be ready for the beginning of the season. And guys, even if he is healthy, let's say everything works out and he is back on the field, I'm nervous about him because he's tied to a limited quarterback. I like Jimmy Garoppolo, but he's not going to be someone that can support a lot of great fantasy options, if any at all. On top of that, the offense is going to be run heavy. We know that. Shanahan loves to use his running backs. And on top of that, Brandon Ayuk was also brought in round 1, which is still kind of a confusing pick for me, but they obviously have some kind of plan for him, so he could lose targets there as well. Guys, the way I'm seeing it, the best case scenario for Deebo Samuel is that he comes back healthy and he finishes as a wide receiver 4. I can't see him getting you consistent value week in and week out. We've already seen him have issues with that, and it's just a product of the system that he plays in. He's going to be a great receiver long term, but this is not really going to be the year for him. And again, we might not even see him on the field. So especially if you're drafting anytime soon, I'm fading Deebo Samuel quite a bit because I don't want him crowding up my bench, just waiting for him to get healthy again, just to have a minimum payoff. This isn't even like A.J. Green. Like, I stashed A.J. Green last year thinking that he might come back at some point. And if he would have, you've got potential wide receiver 1 value right there, right? So he might be worth holding on your bench for a few weeks. But Deebo Samuel, it's a lot of risk for very little reward. Now the other receiver I actually just mentioned, that's Brandon Ayuk, who they drafted in round 1 of this year's draft. He's sitting at about wide receiver 65. His ADP is all the way up in the 200s. So Ayuk's value, as I look at it, is very dependent on Deebo Samuel's health. Like I said, Jimmy Garoppolo is not a quarterback that's going to give you enough volume to be able to support more than one fantasy wide receiver. So the way I'm seeing it, if Deebo Samuel is healthy, the offense he's not going to be able to support 2 wide receivers and George Kittle. Kittle's going to be the number 1 receiving option. We know that. Now, if Deebo misses some time, Ayuk has a real shot at establishing his role early on. He's going to see the field a lot, and it's going to be just like I said with Jalen Reagor, right? Wide receivers that are rookies tend to take some time to really develop, but if you shove them out on the field and just feed them volume, they'll be able to do something for you. So Ayuk, I think that could be very valuable for him. He needs some time to develop and sharpen his route tree, which is not great. He's been primarily used as a field stretcher. That's what he did in Arizona State. He was a quick guy. He got down the field fast. But if you can get him out on the field, get him integrated into Shanahan's offense, and start getting him used to some of those other, short to intermediate routes, then I think he can really kind of establish himself as that wide receiver 1 and may even challenge Samuel for the position when he starts to come back. So now I did mention Ayuk does still seem like an odd fit in San Francisco. He is a field stretcher. Garoppolo isn't exactly known for having a cannon, so my only thought is the coaching staff saw something else in him. They saw his yak ability and liked that a lot, and they're going to try to develop him. And again, if Deebo misses time, a couple other receivers worth mentioning. They do have Kendrick Bourne and Jalen Hurd on the roster as well. One of these guys is going to contribute a little bit at least, but like I said, the offense isn't going to support a ton of fantasy value even for a second receiving option. And on top of that, we just don't really know who's going to emerge out of the 2 of these guys. So maybe keep an eye on them on your waiver wire, but do not draft really under any circumstances. Now on to the last team in the NFC West, and that is the Seattle Seahawks. And when you take a look at the fantasy rankings, it looks like it's setting up to where people think that either Tyler Lockett or DK Metcalf are going to take that number 1 role, and they're just going to run with it. Like the Cooper Kupp and Robert Woods situation, they're only sitting 1 spot away from each other. But guys, the way I'm looking at it, I think you can get great fantasy production out of both of these players. So I'll start with Tyler Lockett. Again, wide receiver 20. His ADP is about 46 right now. He's already shown 2 straight years of improvement, which is great. Last year, an excellent season. 110 targets, little over 1,000 yards, and 8 touchdowns. Now, the biggest threat to his production is the other player on his team. It's DK Metcalf. However, the defense on this team, guys, you heard me mention it before. The defense on this team, even with Jamal Adams, is going to be bad. And this offense is going to be put in a lot of situations where they're going to have to sling the ball around. So because of that, and because of the fact that you have Russell Wilson as your quarterback, this is a guy that can support multiple fantasy options. And when you force him to throw the ball, he's going to make the most of it. Now, the other thing with Tyler Lockett, his production did drop a little bit after his leg injury in Week 10 last year. He did still play through it. I think he might have only missed part of a game. But he's got a set role. He's going to be in the slot. He's always going to be on the field, again, because of that increased passing volume. And on top of that, guys, the running back room right now in Seattle is a mess. Chris Carson's the starter, but he's got issues. They brought in about 15 running backs, it feels like, in the offseason. So I don't know how much they're really going to trust their running backs this year either. And last thing, some people were concerned a little bit about, there were some Antonio Brown rumors. Technically, Josh Gordon is still on that team. Even if Josh Gordon comes back, right, he's seen so little of the field since all of his issues started that I'm not worried about him taking any volume away from anybody. And then the Antonio Brown rumors really seem to have subsided. There was a report that came out that the Seahawks are really nowhere close to signing him or considering him. So that's not something that you have to worry about whatsoever. So again, I love Tyler Lockett. Even with DK Metcalf, I think he's a solid wide receiver too. Pretty low floor, low ceiling. He's going to finish right there as a wide receiver 2 for you, which in the ADPs getting close to the 50s is pretty freaking good value. And then, guys, DK Metcalf, I'm very high on this year. I love watching this dude play. He's wide receiver 21, just one spot later than Lockett, but he is going a little bit earlier than him in the average fantasy draft. His ADP is about 37. So let's just start with his rookie year, guys. Last year, not incredibly efficient. He had 58 receptions on 100 targets, still 900 yards and 7 touchdowns, but I really think he's poised to take a jump in 2020. You shouldn't be all that worried about his inefficiency in year one because, again, rookie wide receiver, they take some extra time to develop, and Metcalf was very, very raw coming into 2019. That's the reason he dropped down to the second round where he did, because the dude is a physical specimen. He's a crazy athlete that just happens to play wide receiver. So the more that he's out there and the more Wilson's throwing him the ball, the more he's going to be able to develop that way. And he showed me enough in 2020 to where I think he could legitimately start to take over the league next year. More targets are also going to be available. Like I said, going to be throwing the ball a lot more next year. And he's already got a role carved out where he's being targeted in the red zone a lot. He was targeted in the end zone, guys, 17 times last year. And if that efficiency improves even a little bit, his numbers could absolutely skyrocket. So, like I said, raw prospect coming out of college, physical freak, he's developing. In this offense with how much they're going to throw the ball, I like him a little more than Tyler Lockett. And the only reason I do is because as he continues to develop, I think he's a wide receiver 2 this year, and he has a wide receiver 1 ceiling if he really just blows the doors off of everything. So, love DK Metcalf this year. He's definitely getting bumped up my draft rankings from where he is right now at 21. And last guy worth noting, they have Philip Dorsett on the team as well. He's wide receiver 93. His ADP is almost in the 300s. So he is going to be the wide receiver 3 in the offense. However, we've seen it year after year. Wilson tends to lock on to 1 or 2 favorites, and those are the guys he's going to continue to go to. Right? Philip Dorsett, he's going to have some value if either Lockett or Metcalf gets hurt. But I think those two have shown enough as wide receivers to where you don't have any real threat of someone else coming in and taking a lot of targets away from them outside of an injury. You might be able to get him in a good daily fantasy play depending on the matchup, but I don't see a ton of value in Dorsett outside of that. Again, unless there is an injury on this team, then you want to be looking at him for the waiver wire. So that is it for the NFC West. When I come back, going to go through the wide receivers of the AFC West, the last division that we have to go through before you guys get my top 30 wide receivers next episode. Also, make sure that you stick around for the end of today's episode, as my top 10 is going to be a little bit different. Going to go through the top 10 fantasy seasons of all time, looking back at some of the great fantasy players of the past. You are listening to the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast, and we'll be right back.
Check out the show that's built on the MMA. From the UFC to extreme cage fighting, they got the fights covered. Check out the GSMC MMA podcast. Get the latest news on past or upcoming fights. Join us as we talk to and about some of the biggest names in the MMA, past, present, and future. When it's the fight game, there's just one show to check out. GSMCpodcast.com/MMA-podcast. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
And welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast. I am your host, BSP, Brandon Soderpenner. Last segment took a look at the wide receivers of the NFC West, and finally going to wrap everything up here with the AFC West wide receivers. Also, don't forget, guys, to follow the show. Again, Twitter is the best way to do this. You get updates on every episode. You'll get notified anytime we put out new content for you, and that's going to be at GSMC_F football. And then, of course, you can follow me. I am at LaMachine17 on Twitter. Again, I'm going to be giving you updates, giving you fantasy news, going to provide you with all the fantasy news and updates that you need. So let's go ahead and get into it, guys. So the Kansas City Chiefs are my first team we're getting into, and that is because of Tyreek Hill. Right now, experts putting him at about wide receiver 3, ADP 8. So he's a solid first-round pick. He missed 4 games last year with an injury in 2019. Didn't quite come back as the same player, but he did finish in the regular season with 89 targets, 860 yards, and 7 touchdowns. So still very good numbers with only playing 12 games. Now, like I said, was not the same player after the injury. That led all the way into the playoffs, so there is a little bit of a question mark of him coming back. He's had time to heal. I don't think it will be an issue, but it's something you at least have to monitor. Top of that, guys, he's had at least 6 touchdowns every year he's been in the league. At this point, it's safe to say that Tyreek Hill is not a fluke. However, I am fading him slightly, and the only reason I'm doing that is because he's not consistent from game to game. We saw him a few times, specifically not last year but the year before, finish with top 2 or top 3 wide receiver numbers at the end of the year from a fantasy standpoint. But just because you're scoring more points than a player like Julio Jones for the year doesn't mean you're better week to week. We saw Tyreek Hill have games where he absolutely blew up and games where he disappeared, and that can really hurt you depending on when these games kind of pop up for him. So I'm putting him about 1 spot behind DeAndre Hopkins. I'm not fading him much because Hill is a very explosive player, and he has the potential to single-handedly win you your matchup from week to week. But again, if I'm picking a receiver this high, which I don't even typically do, but if I am, I want someone that's going to get me the consistent high games and not these crazy peaks and valleys that you can get with Tyreek Hill. So still love Tyreek Hill, just bumping him down a little bit this year. We've also got a lot of other receiving options on this team. I'll start with McCoy Hardman. He is sitting about wide receiver 50. His ADP is at 114. So the second wide receiver spot is really kind of all over the place, guys. I don't even know if there will be a true number 2 in Kansas City, just because we see that Mahomes is not afraid to spread the ball around. But if there's going to be a wide receiver 2, it's going to be McCoy Hardman. This guy has amazing yak ability. And Patrick Mahomes knows that all he has to do is find a way to get the ball into Hardman's hands, and he's going to do something incredible for him. Now, if he gets any kind of real volume, he could be a wide receiver 3. He can be an awesome fantasy addition for you. But again, that's just where the questions are coming in right now. He's my pick to get that spot, but he's still got a ton of competition. Even if he is the number 2, he still has Travis Kelce to worry about. He's got Clyde Edwards-Helaire, who is going to be utilized in the passing game quite a bit from the running back position. And then Sammy Watkins is still there too. So a lot of unpredictability around the situation right now. I don't mind flying McCoy Hardman because, again, he's just so good when he gets the ball in his hands. I think Kansas City realizes that, and I really hope they do everything they can to feed him in 2020. If nothing else, he has great daily fantasy value. He's going to have weeks where he absolutely explodes. Same thing in best ball. I like him there as well. He's someone they can get a little bit later and could potentially win you games from week to week. And then let's not forget the obvious. If Patrick Mahomes is your quarterback, you're always going to have the potential for fantasy value. So that moves me on now to Sammy Watkins. He is wide receiver 60, about 10 rankings below McCoy Hardman right now. His ADP is about 20 spots lower. So Watkins was a former first-round pick, and we see flashes of talent that show why he was from time to time. But he's just never developed into a number 1 receiver. I don't know what it is, if he's just been in the wrong systems or he doesn't have the work ethic. I don't know what it is with Sammy Watkins, but it's frustrating because you feel like he should have the talent to be an amazing receiver, and we never get more than a couple games of that a year. Now, he did have a really good 8-game stretch in 2019. He was a top 10 receiver during that stretch, and then he just disappeared again, which leads me to believe that it's a fluke. This hasn't really happened at any other point in his career, so he was a nice flash in the pan for a minute, but Watkins is not a guy that I'm comfortable really betting on for any reason. I get that a lot of experts like taking him later in rounds because they still see that ability, but guys, Watkins has been in the league for a long time now, and if he was going to turn into something, I think he would have. And let's not forget, he was talking about sitting out last season and just reevaluating his entire situation. So I think he's a risk to even disappear somewhere in the middle of the year. Like, Watkins just has too many question marks around him for me to really want to take the chance right now. And then that leads to Demarcus Robinson. He's a guy that I actually talked about last episode with the PPR targets. So now looking at standard, his ADP is a little bit higher. It's at 294, but still astronomical. He's wide receiver 97 right now. He could be a solid flex option for you with an injury. And again, I like him so much because you can essentially get this guy for free in any draft that you're doing. And the minute that Watkins goes down, which is likely, he's had some issues with that. If Hardman goes down, if Hill goes down again, Robinson immediately steps into that role. And even though he may not be the greatest wide receiver on the field, he will get volume purely because Patrick Mahomes is the quarterback, and this team is going to throw the ball a ton. So again, like stashing him at the end of the roster for when inevitably someone goes down in that Kansas City offense. All right, now moving from an offense with a lot of great options because of its quarterback, we're going to go the complete opposite direction now with the Los Angeles Chargers. It's tough to see because they have legitimate talent at the receiver position, and it's not even that their quarterback is bad in Tyrod Taylor, but he's never been able to really support solid fantasy options. He just doesn't push the ball down the field a lot. He's very safe with the ball. He doesn't take chances, and that's really going to hurt these guys in the offense this year. So start off with Keenan Allen. He's sitting at wide receiver 26. If he had any other quarterback, if he still had Phillip Rivers, I think he's comfortably 10 spots higher. He's a great receiver. He's just tied to a very bad situation right now. Like I said, Taylor is limited, and even if they do go to Justin Herbert, he's underdeveloped, and I think he was overdrafted, to be honest with you. I don't see a lot in his game that I really like, and if he is successful in the NFL, it's going to take a long time for him to really be able to develop all the tools that he needs. He's got a nice arm. He's not particularly accurate, right? He doesn't make any kind of crazy throws at the college level that you think are going to translate well to the NFL. I did not understand him going as high as he did. But enough about him. With the current quarterback situation, you can't really use last season's numbers at all with Keenan Allen, so I'm really not even looking at him because he had a much different quarterback. Tyrod Taylor and Phillip Rivers could not be more opposite. Phillip Rivers is a gunslinger. He's going to take chances. He's going to throw it into windows where your receiver is going to have a chance. Might get picked off, but he's at least going to have a chance at it. You're not going to see that at all with Tyrod Taylor. Now, Keenan Allen, the good news, he will be the number one target. However, that's not necessarily going to mean much, guys. The experts are all over the place on Allen because he is the clear number one on this team. He's a very talented wide receiver, but me personally, I'm fading him. Even at wide receiver 26, I'm fading him. This team, I think, is headed toward disaster this year, even though they have a great defense. The offensive line is pretty much garbage. You've got Tyrod Taylor there as well, leading the team. Best case, you've got Justin Herbert stepping in for him, who I'm not sold on either. I think that Austin Eckler, the running back, is also due for some regression because he did get so much of his production through the passing game. I just don't see things adding up very well at all in Los Angeles, and it's just going to be bad news for Keenan Allen. So I'm avoiding him. Let someone else in your league draft him and take that chance. Yeah, sure, I guess he could come out and have his consistent wide receiver one numbers again, but it's a very low percentage, and that's a lot of draft capital to be investing in someone that is that much of a lottery ticket this early. Now, moving on, you got Mike Williams there as well. He's been a consistent wide receiver 3 fantasy option for the last few years. This year, he's sitting at wide receiver 39. His ADP is up in the 100s. So now he's the number 2 receiver here. There's no real competition for that, but he's the number 2 receiver, again, in a pass-deficient offense. He's also going to have to compete with Austin Eckler and Hunter Henry for targets. And when you have a guy like Tyrod Taylor who likes to play it safe, you're going to see him going to Henry and Eckler a lot more than you're going to see him go to Mike Williams. Now, Williams, the reason he was such a good receiver, again, it all goes back to the quarterback situation. He had Phillip Rivers, right? And Williams, the way he plays receiver best is he is a guy that can go up and get you the 50-50 balls consistently. He's not a particularly great route runner, and he's not going to burn you on speed, but he can go up and get you those contested catches. And he played a role very similar to what I think Michael Pittman's going to do for Rivers in Indianapolis this year. So he got a lot of his numbers like that. He's not going to get those same kind of balls from Tyrod Taylor. He's not going to take those risks. And because of that, I am fading Mike Williams very hard this year. I think his value is going to drop pretty significantly because he's not going to get the volume, and he's just not going to be a wide receiver that pairs well with Tyrod Taylor at all. And then for my last two wide receivers, rather, for Los Angeles, you got Joe Reed and Andre Patton there. I literally just wrote no and circled it. This offense is barely going to support one receiver, much less the third or fourth option. So you have absolutely no business drafting anybody else on the Los Angeles Chargers. All right, so moving from one mess of a wide receiver room to another, albeit for different reasons, let's talk about the Las Vegas Raiders. I have, 5 different guys to talk about here with Las Vegas. It's kind of a jumbled mess right now. So let's start with the guy that I think has the best chance to be the number one receiver there, and that's Henry Ruggs. He's sitting at wide receiver 54. His ADP is about 130. Now, let's get one thing straight immediately, guys. Derek Carr is still a capable quarterback. He seems like he's being forced out, which I'm not surprised about because John Gruden wants his own guy. However, with the volatility of the whole situation, things can really go south fast, even with Derek Carr still starting. But, again, assuming he has some ability left in him, which I think he does, Henry Ruggs has the best chance to take this number one job. If he is utilized the way that he was at Alabama, and that was as an intermediate yak kind of guy, the people assume that if you have crazy speed, that just means that you were used as a field stretcher, that they just sent Ruggs down the field every time and hoped that he would get open. That was not the case at Alabama. If you go back and watch, Ruggs was utilized, again, in these short to intermediate routes. They just wanted to get the ball in his hands and let him go. And if the Raiders are smart enough to use him in that similar kind of a role, I think he has a lot of value this year. What do we know about Derek Carr, guys? He is captain checkdown. He likes to throw the ball short. He likes to take the easy way out. And when you have a weapon like Henry Ruggs, again, all you got to do is get the ball in his hands and just let the guy go to work. Now, the negatives against Ruggs, again, we don't know if that's how they're going to try to utilize him. He's also got all these other wide receivers to compete with. There is not a clear-cut number one yet. They haven't come out and said, who they're going to be putting on the field a ton right away. So he's the best bet, but it's not a guarantee. Also, the Raiders, they've got an underrated offensive line, and they're going to be running the ball a lot this year. They're going to be feeding Josh Jacobs week in and week out. So there may not be a ton of targets to go around, and when you have limited targets and target competition, it has the potential to be a very rough situation for Henry Ruggs. So he's got great upside. I love him in best ball. He is going to be a real target for me in any best ball league that I do. But every single wide receiver in this offense is going to come with some sort of risk. So that being said, the second guy on the list right now, Hunter Renfrow, he is sitting wide receiver 76. His ADP's up in the 200s. Now, Renfrow had a solid rookie season last year. He had 49 targets for 605 yards, 4 touchdowns, played in 13 games. He became one of the favorites of Derek Carr late in 2019. He started going to him quite a bit. I do think his ceiling is significantly lower than Ruggs. The only thing we're really able to base this off of is the fact that he has chemistry with Carr, but again, with all the other receiving options, with the potential of someone else really breaking out, like a Henry Ruggs or even, a Bryan Edwards, someone else on the team taking the spotlight. And then on top of all of that, guys, Darren Waller, the tight end, is probably going to lead this team in receptions. So we're talking about a very limited number of targets to go around here. So there's more risk with Renfrow, and he doesn't have the same ceiling as Henry Ruggs. So not really big on him this year. You got Nelson Aguilar there as well. He's sitting at wide receiver 99. His ADP is almost up in the 300s. So Aguilar is a veteran. You guys know him by now. He's with the Eagles for a long time. He just never really broke out. He's never been able to establish himself as a steady wide receiver. And on top of that, he's coming into a crowded wide receiver room as it is, and he's not really going to have an off season to integrate with the team. So not a lot of good things adding up for Aguilar. You've got Brian Edwards, the receiver out of South Carolina they drafted this year. He's sitting at wide receiver 109, and his ADP has him going undrafted. I think he's got good long-term upside, but he definitely needs development before you're betting on him in any kind of a fantasy perspective. And then Lynn Bowden, who I brought up last week as a nice late PPR target, he's also going undrafted. He's about wide receiver 117, but the reason I like Bowden is because he has crazy versatility. We saw him do everything in college, guys. He played quarterback, running back, wide receiver, and any time that you can do something that puts you on the field more, the higher your chances of becoming a fantasy target become. So, again, Bowden, he's a lottery ticket type of pick, but don't mind stashing him. Don't mind stashing him late in dynasty drafts either, because he could be a nice utility guy for the Raiders going forward. All right, so last team that we are covering for wide receivers, and then we are done, and that is the Denver Broncos. They've got a nice little wide receiver room, albeit a young wide receiver room. So let's start with Courtland Sutton. He's sitting at wide receiver 19. His ADP is about 65. Last year, pretty good season. 124 targets, 1,112 yards, and 6 touchdowns, despite playing with 2 bad quarterbacks and then 1 average one, guys. He had Joe Flacco, he had Brandon Allen, and then finally Drew Lock coming in and showing that he's at least got the potential to be a solid quarterback going forward. Now, Sutton does have competition this year. They spent a high draft pick on Jerry Jeudy, and then they also grabbed KJ Hamler later on in the draft. But with him being in this offense last year and already being able to work a little bit with Drew Lock, I mean, this is his number one receiver job to lose. And then another thing I like about Sutton, guys, even if Drew Lock's production is stagnant and he doesn't really take a step forward, he's still better than Joe Flacco and Brandon Allen. And I think Sutton's going to get more consistent production because of that. I see him as a solid wide receiver too. I don't see him much more than that. I don't see him much less than that either. Another low floor, low ceiling kind of player. But if you need a safe wide receiver too for your fantasy team, I like Courtland Sutton a lot in that spot. So another player I just mentioned, Jerry Jeudy. He is at wide receiver 51. His ADP is up in the 120s. So, guys, you know me, I'm always nervous for rookie wide receivers when they come into the league, especially when they have established players in front of them already. Now, I had Jerry Jeudy as my top wide receiver coming into the 2020 draft, and I still believe that. He's the best route runner. I think he is the most NFL ready, and I like him a lot going forward. But he does still need to develop, and the competition that he has in front of him, I think, could potentially really slow his development overall. On top of that, the Broncos are likely to lean on Melvin Gordon and Phillip Lindsay a little more this year in the running game, especially with Drew Lock being a young quarterback. So Jeudy, while he will get some targets, I just don't think he's going to have a ton. I don't think there's a lot available for him right away. So I like him a lot more in year 2. I just don't see him being able to develop quick enough to be a true fantasy option for you in 2020. He's a lot more of a dynasty option, a good dynasty option, than he is an option for you in redraft leagues. And then finally, guys, KJ Hamler, the other receiver that they picked up later in the NFL draft, he is wide receiver 91. His ADP is all the way up at 268. Now, Hamler is going to be featured, which is good news. He's going to be on the field primarily as a slot receiver. However, the fact that they are putting him in the slot is going to limit his touches overall. Like I said, they're going to want to run the ball a lot more, so I don't know how often their slot guy is going to be, out there and available. He is still going to be the 4th receiving option. He's going to be behind Sutton, Jeudy, and then tight end Noah Fant, and then maybe even Melvin Gordon, guys. He was used quite a bit in the passing game in Los Angeles, so I wouldn't be surprised if the Broncos decided to utilize him as well. So I really don't see a lot of redraft value with KJ Hamler. Again, maybe a late round dynasty pick as this offense really starts to take shape, but even then he's in a tough spot where he's going to be sitting behind the already established Courtland Sutton and then Jerry Jeudy, who I know me and a lot of other experts are very high on going forward with his career. So there you have it, guys. We have covered every single team's wide receiver rooms. So that means next episode, I will give you my top 30 wide receivers for the 2020 fantasy season. And then after that, going to start diving right back in to the fantasy preview series, as I am going to break down the quarterbacks and tight ends of every team in the league, and we'll start you off with the NFC and AFC North. So stick around, guys. We got one more segment for you, going to go through the top 10 fantasy football seasons of all time, reminiscing on fantasy football's past. You are listening to the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast, and we'll be right back.
Check out the show built around the women of MMA. From the UFC to the extreme cage fighting, we got the fights covered.
Listen.
It's the Golden State Media Concepts Women's MMA Podcast. The latest news of upcoming fights, discussions of previous matches. Join us as we talk to and about the biggest names in women's mixed martial arts, past, present, and future. When it's the women's fight game, you know where to listen to. The Golden State Media Concepts Women's MMA Podcast.
Welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast. I am your host, BSP. Covered plenty for you today. Went over the impact of the players that are dropping out of the 2020 season because of COVID. Of course, going to keep you guys updated on that as things progress. Talked about how LeSean McCoy has signed a contract with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Got your 5 burning fantasy questions in for today, and then covered the AFC and NFC South wide receivers, which has officially wrapped up our wide receiver preview series. Again, do not forget to tune into next episode, as I will give you my definitive top 30 wide receivers going into your 2020 fantasy draft. But we've made it to the end of the show, and as always, I am going to reward you with a top 10. Now this week, as I've alluded to, it's a little bit different. It's not an opinion piece. I'm not doing a true ranking based on things that I've broken down, but instead, I wanted to take you guys through a little bit of fantasy football past and give you the top 10 fantasy seasons of all time. So let's get right into it. A couple honorable mentions for you guys. So a couple recent players here in the honorable mentions. Number 16, David Johnson's breakout year finished with 407 fantasy points and then proceeded to fall off a fantasy cliff. Next up was Peyton Manning's 2013 season, fresh off of the neck injury in his first season in Denver. Was able to secure 412 fantasy points. I remember getting him in round 6 that year because people were worried about his potential. So excellent pick in 2013. And then I've got a pair of guys from 95. It's Jerry Rice and Emmitt Smith, who both had incredible fantasy seasons that year, finishing with 414 and 415 fantasy points respectively. Now, before I get into the top 10, there's a couple facts that I noticed about it as I was compiling this list. So only 5 teams are represented that you're going to see. 5 teams out of 10 seasons here, and there's only 7 players on this list as well. So a couple of amazing repeat performances in the top 10. Also, the number 1 and number 10 spot are not exactly close, guys. It was separated by 65.7 points, right? That's 3 elite fantasy games worth of points that these guys are separated by. And we're talking about top 10 of all time. So that's incredible. And then there's 2 quarterbacks on this list. They're 2 newer quarterbacks, which shouldn't be too surprising as the league has moved to throwing the ball more, and the rest are running backs. So when I tell you guys that running backs are important, please believe me, because you're going to see that as we start going through here. So number 10 is Steven Jackson, running back for the then St. Louis Rams in 2006. 415.4 fantasy points. He totaled up 2,334 yards from scrimmage, also hauled in 90 receptions, and finished with 16 touchdowns on the year. So especially in PPR leagues, Jackson was absolutely terrifying, guys. And the number 10 spot got almost 2,400 yards and 16 touchdowns. So that's, again, crazy to think about as we continue to go through here. So number 9 is a very recent performance. You should recognize this name, and that is Lamar Jackson, quarterback for the Baltimore Ravens. His 2019 fantasy season, good enough to land him at number 9 on this list. 415.7 points, so only 0.3 points higher than Jackson's year in 06. 3,127 passing yards. That's not the impressive part. Added on 1,206 yards on the ground and totaled up 36 total touchdowns. So the running game for Lamar Jackson is really what propelled him up onto this list. You're going to be able to get a lot more production out of a quarterback that can run from a fantasy standpoint because the points are just going to be worth more for those rushing yards. And don't forget, another reason this year was so big for Jackson, he did break Michael Vick's rushing record for a quarterback. Vick totaled 1,038 yards, and Lamar Jackson comfortably cleared that by almost 200 yards. So incredible season for Lamar Jackson last year. Number 8, another name you should recognize and really should not be surprised this is on the list. That's Patrick Mahomes, quarterback for the Kansas City Chiefs in 2018. Now, the reason it's only number 8 is, again, he's a quarterback, so the yardage numbers and the touchdown numbers don't count for quite as much as running backs. But that season, still good enough for 417.1 fantasy points, 5,097 passing yards through the air, and 50 passing touchdowns. 50! And he tacked on 2 more on the ground. So 52 touchdowns for Patrick Mahomes in 2018 in his first year as a starter. He had 1 game under his belt to that point from the end of 2017, and he just stepped in and was able to secure the greatest fantasy season by a quarterback of all time. Like I said, only 2 quarterbacks on this list, and they are both gone. Lamar Jackson in 19 and Patrick Mahomes in 2018. So moving on now, number 7, another running back for the St. Louis Rams. This time it's not Steven Jackson, though. It's Marshall Faulk. His 2001 season was able to rack up 419.7 fantasy points, 1,000 yards rushing and receiving, which at that point in 01, I want to say only 3 other running backs had been able to pull off to that point. Now we've got Christian McCaffrey doing it every year, but Faulk was way ahead of his time with how much he was used in both aspects of his offense. So it was able to rack up a total of 2,147 yards and 21 touchdowns, also hauled in about 100 receptions as well. Number 6 is another Kansas City Chief. Like I said, the team's only 5 of them in this exercise, but Priest Holmes, his 2002 season as the running back for Kansas City, this was the first big jump on the list. Marshall Faulk had 419.7 points in the 7th spot. Priest Holmes, 440.7 points. He was able to rack up 2,287 total yards, 21 rushing touchdowns, which is where these numbers just really skyrocketed for him. Also 672 yards through the air and an additional 3 touchdowns. Priest Holmes was an absolute beast for fantasy back in the day. Number 5, a guy that you shouldn't really be surprised is on this list. That's LaDainian Tomlinson, the running back for the then San Diego Chargers. This is specifically the 2003 season. He was able to rack up 443.6 points, 1,645 rushing yards, and an additional 725 receiving yards and 100 receptions, 17 touchdowns total. And guys, the Chargers were not even good that year. They went 4-12, and LaDainian Tomlinson just decided to go out and have one of the greatest fantasy seasons of all time. And spoiler alert, that might not be the last time that you guys hear about LaDainian Tomlinson coming up. Number 4, a name that should be familiar because you heard it about 45 seconds ago, guys. That's Priest Holmes, running back for the Kansas City Chiefs. Just a year later in 2003, managed to put up an even better fantasy season. Racked up 445 fantasy points, 1,420 yards on the ground, an additional 690 through the air, 27 rushing touchdowns. 27! Didn't haul in any through the air, but still able to tack on 70 receptions, adding some PPR value. So 2 monster years in a row for Priest Holmes. Number 3, a name that should sound familiar because you heard it about 2 minutes ago. That's Marshall Faulk, making his second appearance on this list. Running back for, again, the St. Louis Rams. We're actually going the opposite direction with him. In his 2000 season, he had he was even better than he was in 2001. 459 fantasy points, a 14-point jump over Priest Holmes' season in 03, 1,359 rushing yards, 830 receiving yards, 18 touchdowns on the ground, and 8 in the air. So even early on, guys, Marshall Faulk was the Christian McCaffrey of his era, right? He did everything that you needed him to in the passing game, in the run game, and was just an absolute fantasy monster. Now, number 2 to go here, guys. And you just heard me talk about him as well, but it's his first time making his appearance on this list, and that's Christian McCaffrey's 2019 season. I'm not going to go into what I think about him for 2020. It's not important. But running back for the Carolina Panthers last year, 471.2 points. Another big jump, right? He racked up 1,387 rushing yards, another 1,000 receiving yards, 15 rushing touchdowns, 4 receiving touchdowns, and hauled in, I want to say, like 120 passes, guys. He was utilized everywhere, right? He was the offensive weapon for Carolina last year and was able to put up crazy numbers even with Kyle Allen as his quarterback for the majority of the season. So that's number 2, guys. And number 1, a player making his second appearance on this list, the greatest fantasy season of all time, that belongs to LaDainian Tomlinson of the San Diego Chargers. 2006, he absolutely dominated the league. 481.1 fantasy points. Even with McCaffrey's monster year last year, still 10 points behind what Tomlinson was able to do. 1,815 rushing yards, another 509 receiving, but most importantly, 28 rushing touchdowns. 28. That is a number I don't think we're ever going to get anywhere close to. Tacked on another 3 receiving touchdowns that year. So 31 total touchdowns from the running back position. Those are quarterback-like touchdown numbers from a guy who really doesn't have control over when he gets the ball. So LaDainian Tomlinson, if you didn't already know, had the greatest fantasy season of all time, 481.1 fantasy points. So I hope you guys enjoyed that. It was really cool to look back on some fantasy history as we all gear up and start getting ready for our drafts for 2020. And it's not even just all old guys. There are some newer names on there. A couple of quarterbacks who have the potential to keep making this list. And then McCaffrey will be a threat each and every year, especially when the Panthers start coming out of this alleged tank that they're going to be diving into here. So that's going to wrap it up for me today, guys. Thank you again for listening. Been a great show as always. Hope that you enjoyed it. Remember to follow the show and myself on Twitter. You can follow the show at GSMC_F football, and you can follow me at LaMachine17. That's at LaMachine17. So thank you for listening to the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I want to ask that you remember, guys, please subscribe to the show anywhere you can find your podcast and drop a review. Nice or not, let us know what you like about the show, what you want to hear, what we can improve on. We'd love to get your input and opinion on the show, because everything that we get is just going to help make it a better production for you to listen to. So, again, follow us on Facebook. We're on Twitter. We're on Instagram, guys. Any social media platform, you can find the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. So, that's all, guys. Thank you so much for listening. Have a good night, and take it easy.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.